Everyone thinks SpongeBob SquarePants is just a silly cartoon about a sponge who flips burgers. Kids laugh, parents tune out, nobody looks twice. A real marine biologist never saw it that way. That is exactly why this video spends the next few hours pulling Bikini Bottom apart piece by piece. The real man behind Bikini Bottom. Before there was a pink starfish, a grumpy octopus, or a yellow kitchen sponge with a square body and buck teeth, there was a young boy standing on a beach in California, completely fascinated by everything living under the waves. That boy grew up to build an entire underwater city out of his own head, and every strange, funny, oddly detailed piece of that world came from a life spent studying the ocean long before he ever picked up an animation pencil. His name was Steven Hillenburg, and understanding who he really was changes the way the entire show looks. Stephen McDaniel Hillenburg was born on August 21st, 1961, at Fort Sill, an army post in Lawton, Oklahoma. His family did not stay there long. He was raised in Anaheim, California, a place surrounded by beaches, tide pools, and easy access to the Pacific coast. From a young age, he showed two separate interests that most people would assume have nothing to do with each other. One was marine life, the other was drawing. Most kids grow out of one interest or the other as they get older. Hillenburg kept both, and eventually found a way to combine them into a single career that nobody else had really attempted before. His love of the ocean did not come out of nowhere. He grew up watching the films of Jacques Cousteau, the famous French oceanographer who spent decades filming underwater documentaries that introduced millions of people to coral reefs, deep-sea creatures, and the general wonder of life beneath the surface. Cousteau's work was some of the first television footage that let ordinary families see what the ocean floor actually looked like, and it left a heavy mark on Hillenburg as a kid. Watching those documentaries planted the idea that the ocean was not just a place to swim or surf, but an entire hidden world full of strange creatures, tight ecosystems, and stories waiting to be told. That early fascination followed him straight into college. Hillenburg attended Humboldt State University, a school known for its strong environmental and natural science programs, located along the northern coast of California. He earned a degree in natural resource planning and interpretation, with a focus specifically on marine resources. This is not a casual degree. It is the kind of program built for people who want to study coastlines, ocean ecosystems, and how humans interact with them, often with the goal of teaching others or working in conservation. At this point in his life, animation was not the plan. Hillenburg was on a path toward becoming an actual working marine scientist and educator. That path led him to a job at the Orange County Marine Institute, later renamed the Ocean Institute, located in Dana Point, California. He worked there as a marine biology teacher starting around 1984, spending close to 3 years in the role. His job involved teaching visitors, many of them children, about tide pools and the small ecosystems that exist along rocky shorelines during low tide. Tide pools are one of the most accessible ways for regular people to actually see ocean life up close, since they trap small fish, crabs, anemones, and other creatures in shallow water when the tide goes out. Teaching kids about this world meant finding ways to make science exciting and easy to understand, which turned out to be a skill that would matter enormously later on. To help make his lessons stick, Hillenburg created an educational comic book called The Intertidal Zone in 1989. The comic was meant purely as a teaching tool, not as a professional project or a step toward television. It used cartoon versions of real tide pool creatures to explain scientific ideas in a way that felt fun instead of like a textbook. Two of the characters in that comic were named Bob the Sponge and Rocky the Shrimp, and they acted as a kind of host duo, guiding readers through the lesson. At the time, Hillenburg almost certainly had no idea that Bob the Sponge would eventually turn into one of the most recognized cartoon characters on the planet. He was just trying to teach kids about anemones and hermit crabs in a way that would hold their attention. After a few years of teaching, Hillenburg made a decision that changed the direction of his entire life. He decided to go back to school, but this time for animation rather than science. He enrolled at the California Institute of the Arts, often shortened to CalArts, a school widely respected for training animators, many of whom went on to work at major studios. There, he studied experimental animation, which focuses less on traditional cartoon storytelling and more on pushing the boundaries of what animation can visually do. This was a serious shift. He was walking away from a stable science teaching career to start over in a completely different field, based mostly on the pull he felt felt toward drawing and storytelling that had been sitting alongside his love of the ocean the whole time. The move paid off. After finishing his animation studies, Hillenburg landed work in the television industry, eventually joining the staff of Rocko's Modern Life, a Nickelodeon cartoon about a wallaby dealing with the odd and often absurd struggles of everyday adult life. Working on Rocko gave Hillenburg real experience inside a professional animation studio, and it put him directly inside the Nickelodeon system, surrounded by other writers and artists who were building out the network's early lineup of original cartoons. It was during this period that he began developing his own idea for a show, pulling directly from the old Tidepool characters he had created years earlier for his teaching comic. The character, who had been called Bob the Sponge in the educational comic, went through a few name changes as the show idea developed. At one point, he was called SpongeBoy. That name did not last, because it turned out a company already held rights to the name SpongeBoy for use on a line of cleaning mops. Rather than risk a legal fight over the name, Hillenburg changed it to SpongeBob, adding SquarePants to make it distinct and to describe the character's unusual body shape, since sea sponges in real life do not actually look anything like a rectangle wearing pants. The change turned out to be one of those small decisions that ended up defining an entire brand, since SpongeBob SquarePants became one of the most recognized character names in television history. The show officially premiered in 1999, with the pilot episode titled Help Wanted, marking the first time audiences saw Bikini Bottom, the Krusty Krab, and the personalities of SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs all interacting together on screen. Hillenburg served as showrunner for the first 3 seasons, meaning he held the top creative role, guiding the writing, tone, and direction of the series during the years many longtime fans consider the strongest stretch of the show. After season 3, he stepped away from the showrunner position, though he remained connected to the series as an executive producer, meaning he still had creative involvement and oversight, even though he was no longer running the day-to-day writing room. He did not disappear from the franchise during this time. Years later, Hillenburg returned in a more hands-on way to help write the story for the second SpongeBob movie, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, which came out in 2015. This showed that even after stepping back from the main series, he still cared deeply about the direction of the world he built, and was willing to come back when a project felt important enough to warrant his direct involvement. One detail that says a lot about who Hillenburg was as a person involves his own discomfort with how big the show eventually became. As SpongeBob turned into a massive commercial franchise, with toys, plush dolls, and merchandise flooding stores everywhere, Hillenburg reportedly expressed real worry about the environmental impact of all that plastic. Storyboard artist Sherm Cohen once shared in an interview that Hillenburg told him his biggest fear was walking along a beach someday and finding one of the SpongeBob dolls washed up on the shore like ocean trash. Being a marine biologist himself, and someone who also spent time surfing along the California coast, the idea of contributing to ocean pollution through his own character's merchandise clearly bothered him. It is a strange kind of guilt for someone to carry, being responsible for one of the most successful toy lines in the world, while also being a trained scientist who understood exactly what plastic waste does to ocean ecosystems. Hillenburg also seemed to have a clear sense of where he wanted the franchise to stop growing. According to Paul Tibbett, who worked closely with him and eventually took over as showrunner, Hillenburg used to joke that the day anyone tried to make a spin-off show called something like SpongeBob Babies would be the day he walked away from the franchise completely. It was a lighthearted comment, but it reflected a real protectiveness over the core idea of the show and a resistance to letting it get stretched into every possible commercial direction just because it was popular. There is one more small piece of trivia connected to Hillenburg's attention to detail that many longtime viewers did not notice for years. The building that houses the Krusty Krab, the restaurant where SpongeBob works throughout the entire series, is shaped exactly like a lobster trap. Fans eventually pointed this out online, and it fits perfectly with everything already known about Hillenburg's background. A person with a real marine science education would naturally think about ocean fishing equipment and real underwater structures when designing a fictional restaurant building, even if most viewers never consciously registered the shape while watching the show as kids. Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018, at the age of 57. He died from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a serious condition also known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, which affects the nerve cells controlling muscle movement throughout the body. He was survived by his wife, Karen Umland, and their son, Clay. His connection to his wife shows up directly inside the show itself, since the character, Karen Plankton, the computer wife of the show's main villain, was named after her. It is a small, personal touch tucked into a cartoon world, easy to miss unless someone knows the real story behind it. But it is one more example of how much of Hillenburg's actual life ended up woven into the fictional city he built. What makes all of this worth understanding before diving into the theories and mysteries fans have built around Bikini Bottom is simple. Every strange detail, every oddly accurate piece of marine biology hidden in a joke, and every carefully designed building or creature in this world did not happen by accident. It came from a real scientist who spent years teaching kids about tide pools before he ever built a cartoon around it. That background is exactly why so many fans over the years have gone looking for hidden meaning, hidden science, and hidden messages buried inside a show that looks, on the surface, like nothing more than a silly cartoon about a sponge who works at a fast food restaurant under the sea. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But knowing who built the world does not explain everything happening inside it. Long before anyone was debating dark fan theories or scanning episodes frame by frame for secrets, there was already a mystery sitting right in the middle of the show, one that Nickelodeon itself has never fully explained on screen. It involves the one thing everyone in Bikini Bottom seems to care about more than anything else: a food item served at a restaurant shaped like a trap, and a secret so well guarded that even the man who runs the place refuses to let anyone see how it is made. Section 2. The Krabby Patty Formula. Theories. Every single day inside the Krusty Krab, a burger gets flipped, wrapped, and handed across a counter to a customer who has no idea what is actually inside it. The people of Bikini Bottom do not seem to care. They line up for the Krabby Patty like it is the only food that exists in the entire ocean. And somehow, after more than 2 decades of episodes, nobody watching at home has ever been given a full answer either. This is not a small background detail. It is one of the longest running mysteries in the entire show, and it has turned an ordinary fast food burger into one of the most obsessed over food items in television history. The basic setup is simple. Mr. Krabs owns the Krusty Krab, a restaurant shaped like a giant lobster trap, and he is the only person who fully knows what goes into the Krabby Patty formula. The written recipe itself exists on a piece of paper, sealed inside a small glass bottle with a cork stopper. For a stretch of the show, that bottle was hidden somewhere much less secure than fans might expect. In the episode Plankton's Army, Squidward reveals that the formula is actually kept under Mr. Krabs' mattress at his house. Considering how much danger the formula supposedly attracts, hiding it under a bed feels almost careless. But that is where it lived for a portion of the series, before eventually being moved into a safe inside the restaurant itself, which makes a lot more sense for something everyone treats like the most valuable object in the ocean. The reason the formula needs any protection at all comes down to one character: Sheldon Plankton, owner of the barely surviving restaurant across the street called the Chum Bucket, has spent his entire existence trying to steal that recipe. His restaurant serves foods so unpopular that customers can sometimes be counted on one hand, while the Krusty Krab across the street is packed constantly. Plankton is convinced that stealing the formula and copying it is the only way his business will ever succeed, so nearly every scheme he comes up with throughout the show circles back to getting his hands on that bottle. He fails every single time, which has become such a running joke that fans now expect failure to be the outcome before an episode even finishes. One of the more memorable attempts at getting the formula happened in that same episode, Plankton's Army. Plankton manages to recruit a group of his own relatives, tiny copies of himself, to help him break into where the formula is kept. When he finally gets his hands on what looks like the real recipe and reads it out loud, it turns out to include 4 heaping pounds of freshly ground plankton himself. In other words, the paper he stole was a fake, planted specifically to trick him into thinking he had won, while the real formula stayed safely hidden the entire time. It is a clever piece of writing because it lets the show tease viewers with what feels like a big reveal, only to snatch it away with a joke a few seconds later. That pattern of almost revealing something only to pull back at the last second shows up again and again across the series. In the episode Spy Buddies, the formula is shown written out not as a list of ingredients, but as an actual math equation, something along the lines of a simple algebra algebra formula equaling a Krabby Patty. It is a purely comedic moment, since nobody watching a cartoon about a talking sponge expects the answer to their burger mystery to look like a homework problem, but it fits the show's habit of teasing the audience without ever actually giving anything away. Plankton has not relied only on physical theft over the years either. His computer wife Karen has attempted a more scientific approach on more than one occasion, trying to solve the mystery through analysis rather than a break-in. In an episode called Single Cell Anniversary, Karen manages to actually extract and analyze a Krabby Patty using her own internal systems, getting closer to a real answer than almost any other attempt shown across the entire series. That progress does not last, since Karen ends up destroyed before the information can be put to any real use, wiping out what might have been the closest the show ever came to a genuine reveal. A similar attempt happens again later in an episode called For Here or To Go, where Karen tries the same basic method a second time, only for the plan to fail because Plankton's own body had already begun digesting the sample before she could properly finish her work. Both attempts follow the same basic pattern as nearly everything else connected to this mystery. The show lets the characters, and by extension the audience, get tantalizingly close to real information, then finds a new and different way to snatch it away at the last possible second. The safe holding the formula inside the Krusty Krab comes with its own layer of security that fans did not learn about until much later in the show's run. An episode called Friendiversary reveals that SpongeBob is actually the only person who knows the exact combination needed to open that safe, a detail that puts an enormous amount of responsibility on a character usually treated as lovable but not particularly serious. To make sure he never forgets something so important, SpongeBob had attached the combination to one of his own personal memories, involving a moment shared with Squidward. That decision turns into a serious problem later in the same episode, when that specific memory ends up erased from his mind, causing him to lose access to the combination along with it. This small detail adds an entirely new layer to the ongoing mystery, since it means the fate of the most valuable object in Bikini Bottom does not just depend on Mr. Krab's greed or Plankton's constant scheming, but also on the reliability of one particular sponge's memory. Even with all of that secrecy, the show has let viewers see certain pieces of the sandwich over the years, just never the one part that actually matters. Whenever a Krabby Patty gets made on screen, viewers can usually spot a bottom bun and a top bun with sesame seeds, along with what the show calls sea cheese, sea lettuce, sea tomato, pickles, ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, and sea onions. These ingredients line up almost exactly with what you would expect to find on a normal cheeseburger back on land, just with the word sea added in front of each one to fit the underwater setting. None of that is the actual secret though. The two parts of the sandwich that remain unknown are the patty itself and something the show refers to as the secret sauce. And those two pieces are exactly what fans have spent years trying to figure out. A few other ingredients have leaked out here and there without fully solving the mystery. In the episode Friend or Foe, it is mentioned that a small pinch of chum gets added to the formula, which is a strange detail considering chum is normally used as fish bait rather than food people would want to eat. In another episode called The Great Patty Caper, a handful of additional ingredients get mentioned, including flour, barnacle shavings, salt, and turmeric. None of these details combine into anything close to a full recipe, but they do give the impression that the formula is a strange mix of ordinary cooking ingredients and things that only make sense in an underwater world. One ingredient does get repeated across multiple parts of the franchise in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. Several different episodes, along with the film The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge Out of Water, point to love as one of the confirmed ingredients inside the formula. This shows up in Plankton's army and again in an episode called Growth Spout, and it becomes a much bigger plot point in the 2015 movie where the formula gets stolen and taken to the surface world, only for SpongeBob to realize that the missing piece the thieves cannot figure out is the care and feeling put into making it, not a literal object or spice. It is one of the only pieces of the mystery that the show has been willing to confirm more than once, which suggests it was always meant to be part of the joke, rather than something meant to stay hidden forever. The formula has not always caused simple comedic chaos either. One especially memorable episode called Krabby Patty Creature Feature shows just how badly things can go when the recipe gets tampered with instead of protected. bad. In this episode, Mr. Krabs decides to introduce a brand new item called the Secret Patty, developed with help from Sandy, hoping to give customers something different from the usual menu. The new patty is an immediate hit, but it comes with a horrifying side effect. Anyone who eats it slowly transforms into a large, burger-shaped creature, and that creature then spreads the same transformation to anyone else nearby, turning the mutation into something closer to a slow-moving outbreak, sweeping across the entire town. SpongeBob ends up being the only citizen who never eats the secret patty and never gets infected, which puts him in the position of having to find a cure before the entire population of Bikini Bottom is permanently turned into food. He eventually discovers that feeding the infected citizens chum reverses the transformation, curing everyone by the end of the episode, much to Mr. Krabs' frustration over yet another failed product launch. The episode never treats this outbreak as connected to the classic secret formula mystery in any direct way, but it reinforces the same basic idea that has run through the show since the beginning, that whatever exactly goes into a Krabby Patty, tampering with it rarely ends well for anyone involved. Interestingly, later entries in the franchise have added even more information about where the original formula actually came from, sometimes in ways that build on the story shown years earlier in Friend or Foe, rather than repeating it exactly. The film The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge on the Run, along with an episode from the spin-off series Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Under Years, titled Kitchen Sponge, both point to SpongeBob himself as the true original creator of the Krabby Patty formula, adding a new layer to a backstory that most longtime fans had already accepted as fully settled. Rather than contradicting the story shown in Friend or Foe outright, these newer projects add additional detail to a mystery that has always been handled loosely and inconsistently across the franchise, treated more as an evolving piece of ongoing mythology than a single fixed fact locked in from the very first season. This mirrors the same pattern seen throughout every other part of the mystery, where each new piece of information tends to raise just as many questions as it answers. It is also worth pointing out how rarely Plankton's story actually strays from this single obsession, since it highlights just how central the formula has become to the entire show. Across the franchise's long run, only a small handful of episodes, including Walking Small, Atlantis SquarePantis, Band in Bikini Bottom, Chum Bucket Supreme, and Free Samples, feature a Plankton storyline that does not revolve around stealing the formula in some form. Every other appearance he makes, across hundreds of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, circles back to the exact same goal in one way or another. That level of consistency is rare for any long-running television villain, and it shows just how tightly this one piece of ongoing mystery has been woven into the basic structure of the entire series. The mystery took on a life of its own outside the actual show in the summer of 2017, when a theory that had floated around for years suddenly exploded across the internet all at once. The theory suggested that Krabby Patties were secretly made from crab meat, and that Mr. Krabs, an actual crab himself, was essentially serving up members of his own species without anyone in Bikini Bottom realizing it. Fans pointed to an old scene from an episode called Midlife Crustacean, in which Mr. Krabs takes a bite of a patty and reacts with a strange line about now knowing what he himself tastes like. Taken at face value, that line seems to support the theory in a pretty disturbing way. The idea spread so quickly and got so much attention that Nickelodeon's own official social media accounts had to step in directly to shut it down. Responding to a viral post from an Instagram account that had shared the theory, Nickelodeon's team commented that they could confirm, without any doubt, that Krabby Patties are not made from crabs. Shortly after that, Vincent Waller, one of the people who worked closely on the show alongside Hillenburg, added even more detail by stating publicly that Hillenburg himself had confirmed there is no animal protein of any kind inside the patty formula. That detail means the Krabby Patty, according to the people who actually made the show, is meatless entirely, which technically makes it something closer to a veggie patty than a beef or seafood burger. It is a strange twist for a show that spends so much time treating this sandwich like the tastiest piece of meat in the entire ocean. But it lines up with statements from the creative team, not just fan guessing. This is not the only time in entertainment history that a food-related secret has captured public attention in a similar way, though most other famous examples come from actual real-world companies rather than a cartoon restaurant. The exact blend of 11 herbs and spices spices used in Kentucky Fried Chicken's fried chicken recipe has been treated as a closely guarded corporate secret for decades, with the company famously keeping the full written recipe locked away and known only to a small handful of employees at any given time. Coca-Cola has followed a similar approach with its own soft drink formula, often described in company lore as being kept in a physical vault, with only a limited number of people at the company ever having access to the complete recipe at once. Comparing these real-world examples to the Krabby Patty mystery helps explain exactly why fans have taken this fictional secret so seriously for so many years. Audiences already understand from real life that companies sometimes do guard their recipes this tightly, which makes the idea of Mr. Krabs doing the exact same thing with a cartoon burger feel oddly believable rather than purely absurd, even though the entire scenario is obviously exaggerated for comedic effect. The mystery has since made its way off the screen entirely and into the real world in a way that Hillenburg probably never expected. In late 2024, during the celebration of the show's 25th anniversary, the fast food chain Wendy's partnered with Paramount and Nickelodeon to release a limited-time menu item called the Krabby Patty Collab. The meal included a cheeseburger topped with something Wendy's called Secret Krabby Patty sauce, along with a themed dessert drink flavored with pineapple, a nod to SpongeBob's pineapple-shaped house. True to the entire spirit of the joke, Wendy's played along with the mystery instead of solving it. Customers who checked the ingredient list for the sauce on the company's own website found every other part of the burger fully listed except for the sauce itself, which simply noted that it contained egg and nothing else. Even a real company selling a real burger in real restaurants across the country chose to keep the joke going rather than reveal anything meaningful, which says a lot about how much power this fictional mystery still holds over people more than 20 years after it first showed up on screen. Online reactions to the Wendy's collaboration leaned heavily into the same joke the show has been running for decades. Customers trying the sandwich for the first time joked about channeling their own inner plankton while attempting to figure out what exactly made the sauce taste the way it did, comparing it to other well-known fast food sauces, without ever landing on a definitive answer. Wendy's own public statements about the promotion stayed intentionally vague as well, describing the sauce only as a closely guarded recipe without offering any further detail, effectively continuing the same tradition of secrecy that Mr. Krabs himself has maintained inside the fictional world of the show since the very first season. Taken all together, what fans are left with is a strange collection of half-answers stretched across 25 years of television, films, spin-off shows, and now even real-world fast food promotions. The bun, the vegetables, the condiments, a pinch of chum, some flour and barnacle shavings, a confirmed absence of any meat or animal protein, competing claims about who truly invented the recipe in the first place, and somewhere buried inside all of that, an ingredient the show insists on calling love, treated less like a literal item and more like a symbol for why the sandwich works in the first place. It is a clever way for a children's show to avoid ever actually answering the question, while still giving fans just enough pieces to keep arguing about it online for years, and it shows no signs of finally being solved anytime soon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What nobody involved with the show has ever needed to explain away, though, is something far stranger sitting right next to the food mystery. It has nothing to do with what is inside a burger, and everything to do with where the entire city sits on a map, and why so many people online became convinced that the answer to that question was something the network would never want to admit out loud. Section 3. The Bikini Atoll Radiation Theory. There is a name sitting right in the title of this entire show that most viewers never stop to think about. Bikini Bottom is not some made-up word that Steven Hillenburg pulled out of thin air. It borrows the exact same word used for a real place on Earth, a place with a very heavy and very real history behind it. Once fans made that connection, it did not take long before one of the most talked about fan theories in the show's history was born. A theory dark enough that the people who actually made SpongeBob felt the need to speak up and shut it down directly. To understand where this theory comes from, it helps to start with the real Bikini Atoll itself, since almost nobody watching the cartoon as a kid grew up learning about it in school. Bikini Atoll is a real ring-shaped coral reef and island group located in the Marshall Islands, a chain of islands out in the Pacific Ocean, sitting roughly 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. The name itself comes from the local Marshallese language, where the original word Bikini translates loosely to surface of coconuts, a reference to the coconut trees that once covered the islands and helped feed the small community living there. Before the middle of the 20th century, it was home to roughly 167 people, according to most historical accounts, living a quiet life centered around fishing the lagoon and eating coconuts and breadfruit grown on the islands. Generations removed from any connection to the word bikini as most of the world understands it today. That quiet life ended in 1946, shortly after World War II came to a close. In February of that year, a United States Navy officer named Commodore Ben Wyatt traveled to Bikini Atoll to meet with the people living there, including their leader, King Judah. He told them that the United States needed to use their home to test atomic weapons, and that doing so would help prevent future wars and benefit all of humanity. According to written histories of the event, Wyatt framed the request in a way that tied into local customs and beliefs, telling the residents they had been chosen for something important, comparing their sacrifice to the biblical story of the children of Israel being led out of their homeland toward the Promised Land. King Judah is recorded as responding that everything was in the hands of God, a statement that reflected both the deep religious faith of the community and the reality that they had little genuine choice in the matter, given the military presence already surrounding them. The people of Bikini, following their own cultural traditions of cooperation and generosity, agreed to leave their home, believing it would only be temporary. They were moved first to Rongerik Atoll, a much smaller and less livable island about 200 kilometers away, where food and clean water were difficult to come by, and where the population came dangerously close to starvation within just a couple of years. That promise of a short-term move turned into something the Bikinian people would spend the rest of the century dealing with. Once the residents were relocated, the United States military began a program called Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests designed to study what atomic bombs would do to naval ships. Roughly 95 surplus vessels, including captured German and Japanese warships, were gathered and packed into the lagoon to serve as targets. The first test, codenamed Able, took place on July 1st, 1946, when a plutonium bomb was dropped from the air and detonated above the fleet of ships sitting in the lagoon. Reports at the time considered this first test something of a disappointment from a spectacle standpoint, since it missed its intended target point and produced less dramatic footage than military planners had hoped for. The second test, codenamed Baker, took place on July 25th of that same year and proved far more visually shocking. It was the first ever underwater atomic explosion conducted by the United States, and it sent a massive column of radioactive water shooting nearly a mile into the air, raining contaminated seawater back down onto dozens of the ships positioned nearby to measure the blast's effects. It was in the direct shadow of this exact test that the word bikini entered popular culture in a completely different context. Just 4 days after the Baker explosion, on July 5th, 1946, a French designer and former automobile engineer named Louis Réard unveiled a brand new style of two-piece swimsuit at a public pool in Paris called Piscine Molitor. The design was considered so daring and so revealing for its time that Réard could not convince any professional runway model to wear it in public, and he ended up hiring a nude dancer named Micheline Bernardini to model the suit instead, reportedly handing her the entire outfit folded up inside a small tin box to demonstrate just how little fabric the design actually used. Réard chose to name his creation the Bikini specifically because of the ongoing news coverage of the nuclear tests happening on the other side of the world at that exact moment, hoping that the public reaction to his swimsuit would be just as sudden and explosive as the reaction to the bomb tests dominating headlines that same week. That marketing decision from a Paris swimming pool in the summer of 1946 is the entire reason the word bikini exists in everyday language today, completely disconnected in most people's minds from the actual island chain and the people who were displaced from it. Operation Crossroads was only the beginning of what would happen to the real Bikini Atoll. Over the next 12 years, between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated a total of 23 nuclear devices at the atoll. These tests happened in different ways, some in the air, some on the surface of the water, and some underwater, all as part of an effort to understand nuclear weapons and continue developing more powerful versions of them. The most devastating of these tests by far was one called Castle Bravo, which took place on March 1st, 1954. Castle Bravo was the first hydrogen bomb test ever carried out by the United States, and its explosive power turned out to be roughly 1,000 times stronger than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. The blast was so much larger than scientists had predicted that it completely vaporized several small islands within the atoll and blew a crater roughly a mile wide and 200 feet deep into the reef, sending a cloud of radioactive debris stretching an estimated 66 miles across the sky above the Pacific. The fallout from Castle Bravo did not stay contained anywhere close to the test site. Radioactive debris made up of pulverized coral, ash, and water spread out across roughly 100 miles, drifting over other inhabited atolls in the region whose populations had not been warned or evacuated ahead of time. Some of those residents were exposed to the radioactive fallout for 2 full days before any evacuation took place. A Japanese fishing boat sailing roughly 85 miles away from the blast, a boat with the ironic name Daigo Fukuryu Maru, commonly translated into English as Lucky Dragon No. 5, was also caught directly in the path of the fallout. All 23 crew members aboard that boat suffered acute radiation sickness in the days that followed. The boat's chief radio operator, a man named Aikichi Kuboyama, died from his injuries in September of that same year, becoming one of the clearest and most widely reported human casualties connected to the entire Bikini Atoll testing program. Another crew member aboard that same boat, a young fisherman named Oishi Matashichi, survived the exposure and went on to spend much of the rest of his life as an outspoken anti-nuclear activist and author, writing and speaking publicly about his experience until his death in 2021. The contaminated tuna and shark caught by the Lucky Dragon crew before their exposure was discovered, resulting in roughly 2 tons of radioactive fish being buried rather than sold at Japan's Tsukiji fish market. The death of Kuboyama in particular sparked a wave of public anti-nuclear sentiment across Japan, a reaction so significant that some cultural historians directly credit it as part of the inspiration behind the creation of the fictional monster Godzilla, first introduced in a Japanese film released just months after the incident became public knowledge. Traces of the radioactive material from Castle Bravo eventually turned up as far away as Japan, India, Australia, and parts of Europe, sparking global outrage and eventually contributing to international treaties that banned further tests of this kind in the atmosphere, most notably the Partial Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963, which formally ended atmospheric nuclear testing among its signing nations. For the people originally from Bikini Atoll, the promise of returning home never really came true the way they were told it would. In the late 1960s, the United States Atomic Energy Commission declared the atoll safe again and allowed some former residents to move back. That decision turned out to be a serious mistake. By 1978, new studies showed radiation levels were still dangerously high, and the returning residents had to be relocated once again. Even today, decades later, Bikini Atoll remains too contaminated for anyone to safely live there permanently or grow food in its soil, and studies have linked the fallout from these tests to a long list of health issues suffered by people across the wider region, including radiation sickness, burns, elevated rates of thyroid cancer, birth defects, and various other long-term illnesses passed down across generations of affected families. Interestingly, the physical location itself has not remained a dead, lifeless place in every sense of the word. Modern researchers, including marine biologists from institutions like Stanford University, have traveled to the lagoon in more recent years to study how ocean life has responded to decades of radioactive contamination. Their findings describe a surprisingly resilient ecosystem, with large shark populations patrolling the waters, coral reefs regrowing over the sunken wreckage of the ships used during Operation Crossroads, and even some evidence suggesting that certain coral and crab populations in the area show unusual resistance to cancer despite living in an environment still measurably affected by radioactive contamination. Access to the atoll today remains extremely limited and tightly controlled, largely reserved for scientific researchers and a small number of specialized diving expeditions, since the islands themselves remain unsafe for permanent human habitation, even as marine life has slowly reclaimed the surrounding waters. With all of that real history laid out, it becomes much easier to understand why fans latched onto a theory once they realized Hillenburg Hillenburg had named his fictional underwater city Bikini Bottom. The theory argues that Bikini Bottom is not just named after Bikini Atoll by coincidence, but is meant to actually sit beneath it geographically, directly under the exact spot where the United States tested nuclear weapons for over a decade. According to the theory, this would explain almost everything strange about the show. SpongeBob and his friends would not just be regular sea creatures living ordinary lives. They would be creatures whose bodies and minds had been mutated by decades of radioactive fallout soaking into the ocean floor above them, which fans use to explain why a sponge, a starfish, and a squirrel wearing a diving suit are all able to talk, build houses, hold jobs, and behave in ways that are far beyond what any real version of those animals could ever do. Fans supporting this theory point to small pieces of evidence scattered across the show to back it up. Bikini Bottom citizens display abilities that go far beyond anything a real sponge, crab, or starfish could do in nature. From driving cars to running businesses to building entire cities with roads and schools. Real sponges in actual marine biology have no brain, no nervous system, and no ability to move or communicate in any way resembling speech, making SpongeBob's entire personality biologically impossible for the real animal he is supposedly based on. The theory treats all of that unexplained behavior as leftover proof of some kind of environmental transformation, using radiation as a stand-in explanation for why this particular patch of ocean produces creatures unlike anything found anywhere else on the planet. It is an appealing theory in a lot of ways, since it takes something real and historical and uses it to explain something fictional and strange, giving the cartoon a layer of hidden meaning that feels almost like solving a puzzle. The theory grew popular enough online that it eventually reached the people who actually work on the show, and they did not stay quiet about it. Tom Kenny, the voice actor who has played SpongeBob himself since the very first episode, has publicly pushed back against the radiation theory whenever it comes up in interviews or public appearances, treating it as fan speculation rather than anything based on the actual creative intentions behind the show. Steven Hillenburg himself was also known to reject the darker fan interpretations of his work, and people who worked closely with him throughout the show's early years have said the same thing, that Bikini Bottom's name was never meant to carry any hidden meaning about mutation or nuclear fallout. According to those closest to the production, the atoll's name was simply borrowed because it fit the underwater setting and had a fun, catchy sound, not because Hillenburg was building a secret backstory involving nuclear weapons testing. It is worth pointing out how differently this theory has been treated compared to some of the other fan theories floating around online. Unlike smaller, more playful guesses about hidden meanings in individual episodes, this particular theory touches on a very real and very painful chapter of history involving actual people who were displaced from their home and who dealt with the health effects of nuclear fallout for generations. That is part of why the creative team seemed especially quick and especially direct in shutting the theory down publicly, rather than letting it sit unanswered the way some other fan guesses have been allowed to. Turning a real nuclear testing site into a joke about mutant cartoon characters is the kind of thing that can come across as dismissive of what actually happened to the people connected to that history. And it appears the show's creators wanted to make sure nobody walked away thinking the two things were seriously connected. None of this stops the theory from circulating constantly online, even now, more than 2 decades after the show first aired. Every few years, new posts pop up on social media, laying out the same argument, usually presented by someone who has just made the connection between the cartoon's setting and the real atoll for the first time. The staying power of the theory says something interesting about how audiences interact with children's entertainment as they get older. A show built for young kids, filled with jokes about jellyfishing and Krabby Patties, becomes something people want to dig into for hidden darkness once they are old enough to recognize real-world references sitting inside the silly cartoon names they grew up with. Whether or not the theory holds any truth according to the people who made the show, it reveals just how much thought fans have put into a fictional underwater city built originally as a fun setting for jokes about a sponge who lives in a pineapple sitting on top of a real island chain whose actual history remains far heavier and far more consequential than anything the cartoon ever intended to reference. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The radiation theory is far from the only time fans fans have taken something completely ordinary from Mr. Krabs' world and turned it into something much darker, sitting just beneath the surface. In fact, one of the strangest theories, built entirely from things the show itself actually put on screen, involves Mr. Krabs making a deal that most viewers barely think twice about. An agreement involving a ghost, a ship that sails through the sky, and a debt that gets mentioned only once before the show moves on like nothing happened at all. Section 4. Mr. Krabs and the Flying Dutchman Deal. Most jokes on this show come and go inside a single episode and never get mentioned again. One line, however, has stuck with fans for years, buried inside an episode that most people remember only as a silly story about a greedy crab wishing he could talk to his own cash. That one line reveals something about Mr. Krabs that the show never really explains, never brings up again, and never treats with the weight it probably deserves. It suggests that the owner of the Krusty Krab has made more than one deal with a ghost, and that his soul may not even fully belong to him anymore. The episode in question is called Money Talks, and it comes from season 5 of the show. It opens at the Krusty Krab with a small, almost throwaway moment that ends up setting the entire plot in motion. A customer wants to sit at a table that is already taken by 2 elderly regulars. Rather than waiting, the customer offers Mr. Krabs $5 to get the table right away. Mr. Krabs, never one to turn down easy money, kicks the older customers out on the spot and hands the table over. Satisfied with himself, he turns to SpongeBob and says the phrase that gives the episode its name, Money Talks. The idea sticks in his head immediately, and he decides he likes it so much that he wishes it were literally true. Later that night, alone in his home, Mr. Krabs tries to get his own money to talk to him out loud. Naturally, nothing happens, since money is just paper and metal and cannot speak under any normal circumstance. Frustrated, he shouts out that he would do absolutely anything to be able to talk to his money. That is the exact moment a mysterious figure appears in his house, ready to grant the wish, but only if Mr. Krabs is willing to pay a price far bigger than $5. The figure who appears is a character the show calls the Flying Dutchman, a ghost who has shown up across many different episodes of the series, usually tied to spooky Halloween specials or supernatural side plots. Before appearing in Money Talks, this character had already built up a long and fairly detailed history across the show, starting with a brief cameo that most casual viewers likely missed entirely. His very first mention comes in an early season 1 episode called Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost, where he appears only as an illustration on the cover of a magazine, giving no real information beyond his name and general ghostly appearance. His first true physical appearance on screen comes 2 episodes later in an episode called Scaredy Pants, which also happens to be the very first Halloween-themed episode the show ever produced. In that episode, Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob a scary campfire-style story about a ghost who steals souls, using nothing more than a pickle chip as a prop to act out the tale. The story turns out to be more than just fiction, since the real Flying Dutchman shows up by the end of the episode, confirming that this ghostly pirate genuinely exists within the world of the show, rather than being just a spooky bedtime story parents tell their children. Once fully introduced, the character developed a very specific and consistent visual design that has carried through nearly every one of his appearances since. He is drawn with a distinctive chartreuse green glow surrounding his entire body, yellow eyes with black irises, a scraggly beard, and a pirate hat with a noticeable chunk missing from it. He carries a small handbag marked with the word souls, wears an old-fashioned pirate coat, and his body trails off into a ghostly tail rather than a full pair of legs. He speaks with an exaggerated pirate accent throughout the show, voiced by actor Brian Doyle Murray, giving him a rough, growling voice that fits his role as a menacing but ultimately comedic antagonist. According to comments later shared by Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, Hillenburg had a personal fascination with pirate stories and nautical folklore in general, and adding a comedic version of the classic Flying Dutchman legend into the show was something he specifically wanted to include from very early on in the series development. The show has offered a few different, occasionally inconsistent explanations for exactly how this ghost ended up haunting the citizens of Bikini Bottom in the first place. One episode, Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost, implies that his corpse was once used as a window display inside a clothing shop after his death, and that this indignity is the reason his spirit never found peace and instead began haunting the 7 seas indefinitely. Decades later, a feature film titled The SpongeBob Movie: Search for SquarePants SquarePants gave the character a far more detailed origin, revealing that he was once an ordinary human sailor who stumbled upon a powerful and wicked curse while out at sea, a curse that transformed him permanently into the ghostly pirate audiences had already known for years. According to that same film, the Flying Dutchman has spent 500 years searching for a soul capable of helping him reverse the curse and return to being human again, giving his endless soul-collecting hobby, previously played almost entirely for comedy, an actual motivation behind it for the first time. In that particular film, the character was voiced by actor Mark Hamill rather than Brian Doyle Murray, marking a rare instance of the role being recast for a major appearance. Across the many episodes he appears in, the show gives the Flying Dutchman a whole collection of strange personality quirks that go far beyond his role as a soul-collecting villain. According to the episode Your Shoes Untied, he has not worn a pair of shoes in over 5,000 years, a detail that lines up with the fact that his ghostly form trails off into a tail rather than actual feet. Despite going without shoes for that long, the same episode reveals he has somehow managed to win a competition called the Fancy Knotting Contest for 3,000 consecutive years, showing off an impressive list of complicated knots he knows how to tie, including named knots such as the pretzel knot, the double diamond knot, and the square knot, all while remaining completely unable to tie something as basic as a simple shoelace, since he never actually wears shoes to begin with. In the episode Shanghaied, viewers learn that he cannot eat any kind of food without first putting on a special dining sock, an oddly specific requirement for a ghost who otherwise seems to defy most normal physical rules. In Scaredy Pants, his own debut episode, he expresses genuine annoyance at the tradition of Bikini Bottom residents dressing up as him for Halloween, complaining that the practice turns the Flying Dutchman name into what he calls a laughingstock, a strangely relatable complaint for a supposedly terrifying supernatural figure to have about his own popularity. The Flying Dutchman also serves as the keeper of a location referred to throughout the show as Davy Jones's Locker, treated within the world of the series as a kind of underwater stand-in for a place of eternal punishment. According to the show's own internal logic, this locker is not some vast supernatural realm, but an actual, literal locker, filled entirely with old, sweaty socks, explained away with the joke that the real Davy Jones simply works out a great deal and never bothers to wash his gym clothes. Mr. Krabs himself came dangerously close to being stuffed inside that very locker in the earlier episode Born Again Krabs, an appearance that happened well before the events of Money Talks and shows that his history of dangerous run-ins with the Flying Dutchman extends further back than the soul-selling reveal alone. In yet another appearance, an episode called Ghost Host shows the Flying Dutchman temporarily losing his ability to frighten anyone at all, treating his supernatural scare factor as something that can apparently weaken or fade over time, just like any other skill. Beyond his many television appearances, the Flying Dutchman also became a recurring video game villain, almost from the very beginning of the franchise's expansion into interactive media. He served as the final boss in the earliest SpongeBob video game ever released, titled SpongeBob SquarePants: Legend of the Lost Spatula, and went on to headline his own dedicated game a few years later called SpongeBob SquarePants: Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, where he serves as the primary antagonist players must face throughout the entire adventure. He also appears as a boss character in Super Sponge, an enemy in Operation Krabby Patty, and a supporting antagonist within the widely praised game SpongeBob SquarePants: Battle for Bikini Bottom, showing just how central this one ghostly pirate character became to the franchise's identity across formats far beyond the original television series alone. Once Mr. Krabs wakes up the next morning, he assumes the whole encounter with the ghost was just a strange dream, right up until his money actually starts talking to him. At first, this feels like a dream come true for someone as obsessed with wealth as he is. He rushes to the Krusty Krab, pulls every dollar out of the restaurant safe, and brings it all home so he can enjoy his new power in private. The excitement does not last long. The money, now able to speak, immediately starts demanding to be spent on things Mr. Krabs has no interest in buying, including fairy princess costumes, corn dogs, and diapers. Rather than a blessing, the ability turns into a non-stop nagging headache, with his own cash constantly whining and pestering him to be spent on nonsense he never wanted in the first place. Desperate to get rid of the curse, Mr. Krabs tries several ways to pass pass the money off to someone else, including at one point trying to hand a bag of it to SpongeBob and asking him to bury it somewhere far away. Every attempt fails, and the money always finds its way back into his possession. Eventually, worn down and regretting the entire deal, Krabs calls out for the Flying Dutchman again, begging him to take the curse back and demanding some kind of refund. The Flying Dutchman returns, but not with good news. According to the deal, all sales are final, and now that Mr. Krabs wants out, it is time to collect the actual payment, which means it is time to take his soul. This is where the episode delivers the twist that fans still bring up years later. When the Flying Dutchman reaches into his bag, expecting to pull out Mr. Krabs' soul, he instead pulls out a piece of paper, an IOU, which stands for I owe you. Confused, he demands an explanation, and Mr. Krabs sheepishly admits that he has already sold his soul before, not once, but apparently several times over, to an entire lineup of other ghosts and monster-like creatures who all step forward, each claiming their own piece of paper, proving Mr. Krabs owes them the exact same thing. The Flying Dutchman is stunned, both by the fact that Mr. Krabs handed over his soul so casually in the first place, and by the fact that he was clearly not the first ghost to make that exact deal with him. Standing at the very end of that line of ghosts and monsters is SpongeBob himself, holding his own IOU. When the Flying Dutchman asks in disbelief whether Mr. Krabs owes SpongeBob too, SpongeBob explains simply that Mr. Krabs was $5 short on his payday at some point, and the two of them worked out an arrangement to cover the difference. The basic idea of a person trading away their own soul in exchange for something they desperately want is far older than this one SpongeBob episode, and far older than the show itself. Stories built around this exact concept have existed in various forms across European folklore for centuries, most famously through the legend of Faust, a German story dating back hundreds of years about a scholar who agrees to give his soul to a devil-like figure in exchange for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasure during his remaining years alive. That basic story structure, a person trading away something as valuable and permanent as their own soul in exchange for a shortcut to wealth, knowledge, or power, has been retold and reworked across countless books, plays, operas, and films in the centuries since, making it one of the most recognizable storytelling templates in all of Western literature. Money Talks essentially borrows this same ancient narrative shortcut and applies it to a children's cartoon about a greedy crab who wants to talk to his own cash, using the audience's built-in familiarity with deals made with the devil to make Mr. Krabs' quick, thoughtless decision land as an instantly understandable joke, even for viewers who have never heard the word Faust in their entire lives. That single scene, played almost entirely for laughs, is the only time the show ever confirms Mr. Krabs has made more than one deal involving his soul. The episode never explains what any of those earlier deals were for, who those other ghosts and monsters are, or when any of those arrangements took place. It simply presents it as an already established fact, treated with the same casual tone as someone admitting they have unpaid parking tickets scattered across town. For a children's cartoon, it is a surprisingly dark detail to drop into the middle of a joke about talking money, and it is exactly the kind of throwaway line that fans love picking apart once they notice it. It is worth pointing out that the Flying Dutchman was not a brand new character invented just for this one episode. He had already appeared in the show multiple times before Money Talks aired, most notably in Halloween-themed episodes where he serves as a kind of seasonal villain, haunting Bikini Bottom and testing the bravery of characters like SpongeBob and Patrick. He continued showing up in episodes after this one as well, including Arg, Your Shoes Untied, Shanghaied, Ghost Host, and a special episode called SpongeBob vs. the Big One, where he briefly mentions once dating a character referred to as Aunt Sally back in his own version of high school, adding yet another small, strange piece of trivia to a character already full of them. In nearly every one of these appearances, his role stays tied to ghost stories, curses, or supernatural mischief, rather than anything connected back to the soul-selling business revealed in Money Talks. The show never revisits the idea that Mr. Krabs owes his soul to an entire lineup of creditors, and no future episode ever brings up the topic again in any serious way. It exists as a single isolated piece of information that the show handed handed to viewers once and then moved on from completely, almost as if daring the audience to nerd it and wonder what it actually means. Taken purely as comedy, the joke works perfectly well on its own. Mr. Krabs is established across the entire series as a character defined by his love of money above almost everything else, including his own dignity, his employees, and occasionally even basic safety. Having him casually reveal that he has sold pieces of himself away multiple times just to save a few dollars here and there fits his personality so well that most viewers laugh at the moment without thinking twice about it. But once fans started rewatching the episode as adults, that same joke started to feel like a strange little crack in the show's otherwise cheerful surface. A children's cartoon rarely puts a line like that into an episode without at least a small part of the writing team knowing exactly how strange it sounds out of context. Nothing about this scene gets any kind of follow-up or deeper explanation anywhere else in the franchise. There is no episode showing what Mr. Krabs originally traded his soul for the first time. No scene showing the other ghosts and monsters ever showing up to collect what they are owed, and no acknowledgement from any other character that this information should probably be concerning. It sits in the show exactly the way a lot of throwaway background jokes do, fully confirmed on screen, fully canon, and almost completely ignored by everyone involved, including Mr. Krabs himself, who seems far more upset about losing his money's cooperation than about the fact that his soul apparently belongs to a small crowd of supernatural creditors, one of whom happens to be a ghostly pirate who has not worn shoes in 5,000 years and still finds time to win a knot tying contest every single year regardless. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mr. Krabs is far from the only person walking around Bikini Bottom with something unusual buried in his history that the show only barely touches on. Some fans have gone even further than a single deal with a ghost, building an entire theory around Mr. Krabs that stretches across dozens of episodes, trying to explain exactly how a crab who claims to only care about money somehow keeps demonstrating abilities that have nothing to do with running a restaurant at all. Section 5. The 7 Deadly Sins Theory. Some fan theories about this show are built entirely on wild guessing. This one is different because it borrows its entire structure from something with a very long real-world history, a list of behaviors that religious scholars have been writing about for close to 2,000 years. Fans took that ancient list and laid it directly over the main cast of Bikini Bottom, and the fit turned out to be close enough that even people who worked on the show ended up commenting on it publicly. Before getting into how the theory applies to the characters, it helps to understand where the idea of the 7 deadly sins actually comes from, since it is much older and much more complicated than most people realize. The concept did not start as a single official list handed down all at once. It began around the year 375 when a Christian monk named Evagrius Ponticus, living among a community of ascetic monks in the Egyptian desert, wrote down a list of what he called 8 evil thoughts, sometimes translated as 8 tempting thoughts or 8 demons. His original list included gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, sloth, vainglory, and pride. Evagrius was not writing for the general public at all. His work was intended specifically as private guidance for fellow monks living an extremely strict, isolated lifestyle, meant to help them recognize and resist the specific mental temptations that could pull a person away from a life devoted entirely to prayer and discipline. Evagrius eventually taught a student named John Cassian, who took these same 8 tempting thoughts and carried them from the Greek-speaking Eastern Church into the Latin-speaking Western Church, translating and adapting the concept along the way in his own influential writings. Cassian's versions of the list helped lay much of the foundation for monastic life across Western Europe in the centuries that followed. It was not until roughly the year 590 when a monk named Gregory became Pope Gregory I, commonly remembered today as Gregory the Great, that this list of 8 was reworked into something closer to the version most people recognize now. Gregory removed sloth as its own separate category and added envy in its place, and rather than treating pride as simply one item on the list, he described it as the root cause, sitting above and behind all the other sins, the underlying force that gave rise to the rest. Over time, through further discussion, translation, and teaching across the medieval church, this eventually settled into the now familiar list of 7: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. This list did not stay confined to religious teaching and monastery walls for long. Centuries after Gregory's rework, the English writer Geoffrey Chaucer included a lengthy discussion of the 7 deadly sins within The Parson's Tale, one of the concluding stories in his famous collection, The Canterbury Tales, helping introduce the concept to a much wider audience of everyday readers, rather than just clergy and religious scholars. Around this same general period, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri built an entire section of his famous poem Purgatorio around these same 7 behaviors, organizing an entire level of the afterlife around correcting each individual sin, giving the concept an enduring, vivid structure that stuck in the public imagination for centuries afterward. Visual artists picked up on the idea as well, including the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, whose famous painting depicting the 7 deadly sins arranged around a central image of Christ helped spread the concept even further among people who might never have read a single religious text discussing it directly. Because of contributions like these across literature and visual art, the 7 deadly sins turned into one of the most recognizable moral frameworks in Western history, eventually finding their way into countless books, paintings, sermons, and, many centuries later, cartoons. The concept has continued showing up in modern entertainment well outside of any religious or historical context, further cementing its place in popular culture. The 1995 film Seven, starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, built its entire plot directly around a serial killer who commits a series of murders, each one designed to represent a different one of the 7 deadly sins, using the ancient religious framework as the backbone for a modern crime thriller. That film helped introduce or reintroduce the concept to an entirely new generation of moviegoers who may never have encountered the list through religious study, showing just how flexible and durable this particular piece of medieval theology has remained across nearly 2,000 years of retelling in wildly different contexts, from monastery writings to Renaissance paintings to modern Hollywood thrillers to, eventually, a Nickelodeon cartoon about a sponge who lives in a pineapple. The SpongeBob version of this theory argues that each of the show's core characters was built, whether on purpose or not, around one of these 7 behaviors, taken to an extreme, exaggerated level that makes for good comedy. Fans have shared slightly different versions of the exact matchups over the years, but one lineup has become the most widely repeated, and it lines up character personalities with the sins in a way that holds up surprisingly well once you start rewatching old episodes with that idea in mind. Patrick Star gets connected to sloth, and this is usually considered the most obvious and least debated match in the entire theory. Sloth refers to laziness, a lack of motivation, and a general unwillingness to put in effort or make positive changes. Patrick spends an enormous amount of his time doing absolutely nothing, often shown lying under his rock with no interest in getting up, working, or accomplishing anything at all. This is not just background flavor either. In the Season 2 episode Big Pink Loser, the show directly leans into this trait by having Patrick literally win an award for doing nothing longer than anyone else in Bikini Bottom. That detail alone makes the sloth connection feel less like fans stretching to find a pattern and more like something the writers were fully aware of and willing to joke about directly. His laziness shows up again and again in different forms across the series, whether he is refusing to help SpongeBob with even the simplest task, sleeping through events that directly affect him, or treating basic chores and responsibilities as something to be avoided at almost any cost. Squidward Tentacles is usually placed under wrath, which covers uncontrolled anger, bitterness, and hostility toward others. Squidward spends most of the series in a state of constant frustration, whether it is toward his job at the Krusty Krab, his neighbors SpongeBob and Patrick, or Bikini Bottom in general. He rarely seems to enjoy anything, and his default emotional state throughout most episodes leans toward irritation or outright hatred of whatever is happening around him. Fans supporting this match point to the sheer number of episodes built entirely around Squidward's anger boiling over, usually triggered by something small that spirals into a much bigger reaction than the situation calls for. His frustration is rarely limited to quiet complaining either, since many episodes show him actively lashing out, plotting minor revenge schemes, or completely losing his composure in front of customers, co-workers, and neighbors alike, reinforcing wrath as one of the clearest, most consistently reinforced personality traits belonging to any character on the show. Mr. Krabs represents greed, and out of every character in the entire theory, this is the one almost nobody argues with. His defining trait across the whole series is an obsession with money that goes far beyond normal business sense, often putting profit ahead of the safety, comfort, or well-being of the people around him, including his own employees. This shows up directly in the Season 2 episode Squid on Strike, where Squidward and SpongeBob attempt to protest working conditions at the Krusty Krab, only for Mr. Krabs to find ways to exploit the situation further rather than address their concerns. His greed also gets turned into an actual musical number in the episode Selling Out, where he sings enthusiastically about the joy of making money, treating greed less like a flaw and more like a personal philosophy he is proud of. Because this trait is shown so constantly and so directly across the entire run of the show, greed has become the single most agreed upon piece of the entire 7 deadly sins theory, showing up in some form in nearly every episode where Mr. Krabs plays any significant role at all. Sheldon Plankton fits under envy, driven by his endless jealousy of Mr. Krabs' success and his obsessive desire to steal the Krabby Patty formula so his own restaurant can finally succeed. Nearly every scheme Plankton comes up with throughout the series traces back to this same jealousy, watching the Krusty Krab thrive while the chum bucket sits empty, and refusing to accept that outcome no matter how many times his plans fail. Some fans have pointed out that Plankton's behavior could just as easily be argued as pride or wrath, since his schemes often involve aggressive attacks and an inflated sense of his own cleverness. But envy remains the most commonly used label for him across most versions of the theory, largely because his entire motivation at its core always traces back to wanting something Mr. Krabs already has, rather than pursuing success on entirely independent terms. Sandy Cheeks is typically connected to pride based on how confident she is in her own abilities as a scientist, an athlete, and a proud representative of Texas, a detail she brings up constantly throughout the show. Sandy rarely backs down from a challenge and often makes her intelligence and physical toughness a central part of how she interacts with other characters, sometimes coming across as boastful about her own skills. This kind of self-assured, occasionally show-off attitude fits closely with how pride is traditionally defined, an excessive confidence in one's own worth or abilities. Her pride occasionally works against her directly, most clearly in episodes where she refuses to admit when she is outmatched or wrong, insisting on proving her own toughness, even when doing so puts her in unnecessary danger. Gary the Snail usually gets placed under gluttony, tied to the frequent jokes throughout the series about SpongeBob needing to remember to feed him. Gluttony as a concept is defined by overindulgence, especially around food, and the running gag of Gary needing to be fed, sometimes even running away or acting out when he gets forgotten, lines up with that definition in a simple, direct way. Some versions of the theory swap this position out for Mrs. Puff instead, pointing to her own frequent scenes involving food and cake, which shows that even among fans, this particular matchup is one of the least settled pieces of the whole theory. That leaves SpongeBob himself, who gets connected to lust in most versions of this theory, and this happens to be the single most debated and least agreed upon part of the entire idea. Lust typically refers to intense desire, often romantic or physical in nature, and applying that directly to SpongeBob feels like a strange fit for a character who is mostly known for his enthusiasm about his job, his friendships, and his general childlike excitement about everyday life. Some fans have tried to stretch the definition of lust to cover an intense desire for anything, including SpongeBob's borderline obsessive love of working at the Krusty Krab and flipping Krabby Patties, arguing that his passion for his job reaches a level that goes beyond normal enthusiasm, technically fitting a broader definition of lust as an overwhelming desire for something, even if that something is simply flipping patties, rather than anything romantic. This theory eventually reached a large enough audience that the actual cast of the show ended up commenting on it directly. During a reunion video produced for Esquire, several voice actors from the series discussed some of the biggest fan theories built around the show, including this exact 7 deadly sins comparison. Roger Bumpus, the voice of Squidward, pointed out that he could personally see clear similarities between Patrick and Sloth and between Mr. Krabs and Greed, but did not feel the same connection applied cleanly to the rest of the cast. Mr. Lawrence, who both writes for the show and voices Plankton, offered a more detailed response, explaining that while each character clearly has strong, exaggerated personality traits, he did not think those traits were ever meant to map perfectly onto a specific religious concept during the writing process. He pointed out that Plankton's jealousy toward Mr. Krabs lines up naturally with envy, but that Plankton's aggressive, self-interested behavior could just as easily be read as pride or wrath instead, showing how flexible and interpretive this entire theory really is once you look closely at any single character. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, specifically addressed the lust connection during that same discussion, and his response highlighted exactly why that particular matchup always feels like the weakest link in the whole theory. According to Kenny, if there was ever a driving desire behind SpongeBob's character, it would simply be wanting to work more hours at the Krusty Krab, not anything resembling the traditional definition of lust at all. That comment from the character's own voice actor lines up with what most casual viewers already sense watching the show, that SpongeBob's defining trait is pure, uncomplicated enthusiasm for his job and his friendships, not anything darker or more complicated hiding underneath. None of this means the theory falls apart completely, since theories like this were never really built to be confirmed or denied by the creative team in the first place. They exist as a kind of lens fans can choose to view the show through, a way of noticing patterns in personality that repeat across hundreds of episodes, even if the writers never sat down with a checklist of religious sins while designing each character. Stephen Hillenburg's own comments throughout his career support this same conclusion. He was never on record treating his characters as symbolic stand-ins for anything beyond fun, exaggerated personalities designed to make kids laugh. Mr. Krabs is not obsessed with money because he was built to represent greed as a concept. He is obsessed with money because exaggerated obsession makes for a funny, easy-to-understand joke that works for an audience of children just as well as it works for adults watching along with them. What makes this theory stick around anyway, even without any official confirmation, is how naturally it seems to fit once you start looking for it. Nobody needed to force these connections. The show's own writing, across dozens of different writers and hundreds of episodes over more than 2 decades, kept landing on the same exaggerated traits for each character again and again. Greed for Krabs, laziness for Patrick, anger for Squidward, jealousy for Plankton, pride for Sandy. Whether that consistency comes from the writers intentionally leaning into moral archetypes, or simply from strong, well-built characters staying true to themselves episode after episode, the end result looks the same either way. A cast of characters that maps almost perfectly onto one of the oldest moral frameworks in Western history, a framework that began as a private warning written by a desert monk to his fellow monks, nearly 1,700 years before anyone had ever imagined a talking sponge who flips burgers for a living, purely by coincidence or purely by good writing, depending on who you ask. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sandy Cheeks brings up something interesting that this theory only touches on briefly, and it deserves a much closer look on its own. Out of every character living in Bikini Bottom, she is the only one who does not actually belong there by nature, a land creature wearing a full diving suit just to survive in a city built entirely underwater. That single detail opens up a much bigger conversation about how the show handles science, biology, and the strange rules of a world where a squirrel from Texas can casually run laboratory experiments next door to a sponge who cooks burgers for a living. Section 6. Sandy Cheeks and the Science of Bikini Bottom. Every single character living in Bikini Bottom shares one basic trait that makes their entire existence possible without any real explanation needed. They live underwater, and since they are all some form of sea creature, breathing water instead of air is simply part of their biology. Then there is Sandy Cheeks, a squirrel, an actual air-breathing land mammal, walking around, talking, building machines, and throwing karate chops in a city sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Her presence raises a question none of the other characters ever have to deal with, and the show spends a surprising amount of time, spread out across more than 2 decades of episodes, slowly working out an answer. Sandy made her first appearance in the very first episode of the entire series, an episode called Tea at the Tree Dome, which aired on May 1st, 1999. In her debut scene, before viewers even get a proper introduction to who she is, Sandy is shown wrestling and fighting off a giant clam that is trying to attack her, immediately establishing her as tough, capable, and completely unafraid of danger, despite being far smaller than most of the creatures around her. This first appearance set the tone for how her character would be written for the rest of the show. He was never going to be a delicate outsider struggling to survive in a strange environment. She was going to be one of the toughest, most physically capable characters in the entire cast, land mammal or not. Her home is called the Tree Dome, and the show treats it as a real feat of engineering. string, rather than just a magical solution the writers came up with to avoid explaining anything. The tree dome is described and shown on screen as a large glass dome filled with air instead of water, allowing Sandy to remove her diving suit and breathe normally while inside. Within that dome, she has managed to recreate a small piece of dry land life, including an actual tree, a picnic table, a hamster wheel for exercise, and even a small bird bath, giving her a livable, comfortable space that looks nothing like the ocean floor surrounding it on the outside. The idea of building a self-contained, air-filled environment underwater is not something the show treats casually either. It gets shown repeatedly as something Sandy actively maintains and defends, reinforcing the idea that her survival at the bottom of the ocean depends entirely on continuous scientific upkeep, not some accident of nature. In principle, the basic idea behind the tree dome is not too far removed from real-world engineering challenges faced by actual underwater research stations and habitats, built by real marine scientists, which also depend on sealed, pressurized, air-filled environments to keep human researchers alive and breathing normally while working at ocean depths their bodies could never survive unprotected. Outside the safety of her tree dome, Sandy relies on a specially designed suit to survive, a full-body diving outfit topped with a clear round helmet, allowing her to move through Bikini Bottom and interact with everyone else, despite the fact that she cannot breathe water the way they can. This detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, since it draws a hard, consistent line between Sandy and literally every other character on the show. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and Plankton never need any kind of equipment to survive in their own environment because they belong there naturally. Sandy is the only member of the main cast who has to actively engineer her own survival every single day just to exist in the same world as her friends, and the show never lets viewers forget that difference, even during her most lighthearted appearances. For a long stretch of the series, the show never gave a full, clear explanation for why exactly Sandy left Texas and settled at the bottom of the ocean in the first place. Early hints suggested she had come to Bikini Bottom specifically to study sea creatures and observe their behavior and lifestyle, framing her as a dedicated field scientist who chose the strangest possible research location imaginable. This explanation fit naturally with everything else fans already knew about her personality, since Sandy is consistently shown across the series as one of the most intelligent, most scientifically minded characters in the entire cast, alongside Plankton, who pursues science with far less honest intentions. Her career as a working scientist gets fleshed out more directly starting around season 4, particularly in an episode called Chimps Ahoy. In that episode, viewers learn that Sandy's tree dome and her broader research work are actually funded and overseen by a company called Tree Dome Enterprises, whose board of directors happens to be made up of a group of chimpanzees who occasionally show up in person to inspect her work and decide whether her funding should continue. This detail is played mostly for comedic effect, since the idea of intelligent, business suit-wearing chimps evaluating a squirrel scientist's underwater research project is exactly the kind of absurd premise this show is built on. Underneath the joke, though, it establishes something fans had been wondering about for years, that Sandy's presence in Bikini Bottom is not random or magical, but the result of an actual organized research operation with its own management structure, budget concerns, and oversight, just like any real scientific institution back on land. Sandy's scientific achievements throughout the series go well beyond simply surviving underwater. She is shown building all kinds of machines and inventions inside her tree dome, using tools and equipment that none of the other characters would even know how to operate. This constant stream of inventing reinforces her role as the resident brains of Bikini Bottom, a character whose intelligence and technical skill set her apart from everyone else in a city mostly filled with fast food workers, failed restaurant owners, and one extremely lazy starfish. Alongside Plankton, who uses his own intelligence for schemes and sabotage, Sandy stands out as one of the only characters on the show consistently portrayed as genuinely smart in a serious, functional way, rather than smart purely for the sake of a joke. Her physical abilities get just as much attention across the series as her scientific mind does. Starting with an episode called Karate Choppers, Sandy introduces SpongeBob to karate, and the two of them go on to practice martial arts together throughout dozens of future episodes, often turning their sparring sessions into a running piece of their friendship rather than a one-time gag. Karate itself is a real martial art with a long documented history, originally developed on the island of Okinawa, influenced heavily by earlier Chinese fighting traditions, before becoming its own distinct practice. It later spread to mainland Japan during the early 20th century and eventually became one of the most widely recognized and practiced martial arts in the entire world. The show never explains where Sandy first learned karate herself, but her constant use of it fits naturally with her broader personality, a character who treats physical toughness and discipline as just as central to her identity as her scientific intelligence. She also shows off serious physical strength and competitive drive in other episodes, including a memorable anchor throwing contest in an episode called Muscle Bob Buff Pants, and a full lineup of dangerous extreme sports in an episode called Pre-Hibernation Week, where she pushes herself and her friends through increasingly risky physical challenges before her yearly hibernation begins. Taken together, these episodes build Sandy into a character who is not just intelligent, but athletically dominant as well, capable of outperforming nearly everyone else in Bikini Bottom physically, despite technically being the smallest land mammal living among a city of much larger sea creatures. That yearly hibernation is worth pausing on, since it represents one of the clearest examples in the entire show of real-world animal biology being folded directly into a joke, even if the show simplifies the science somewhat for the sake of a good story. In real life, the relationship between squirrels and hibernation is actually more complicated than most people assume. True, deep hibernation, the kind involving a dramatic drop in body temperature and a heart rate slowed down to a small fraction of normal, is mostly limited to ground-dwelling squirrel species, including certain types of ground squirrels found even within Texas itself. Tree-dwelling squirrels, including the common fox squirrel found across much of Texas and often considered the state's most widespread squirrel species, generally do not go through this kind of deep hibernation at all. Instead, they rely on a lighter, shorter-term state called torpor, essentially resting through the coldest days by staying inside their nests, slowing their activity, and living off food they cached ahead of time, before returning to normal activity once the weather improves. Animals relying on true hibernation still need to build up significant body fat and energy stores ahead of time, since they will not be eating regularly once hibernation begins. The show directly references this general biological process in an episode called Survival of the Idiots, which shows Sandy in the middle of her hibernation cycle, portrayed as noticeably larger and puffier than her usual appearance, a visual choice that lines up with how many real hibernating animals build up fat before going dormant. Even if the specific squirrel species most associated with Texas would technically be more likely to experience lighter torpor than a full winter-long hibernation in the wild. It is a small detail, easy to miss if you are not paying attention, but it shows that even in the middle of a silly, over-the-top cartoon plot involving mistaken identity and confused sea creatures, the show still leaned on real, if slightly simplified, animal behavior to build the joke in the first place. Sandy's connection to Texas gets its own dedicated spotlight in an episode simply titled Texas, which reveals a softer, more vulnerable side to a character who is usually shown as tough and unshakable. In this episode, Sandy becomes seriously homesick, missing her home state so badly that she considers leaving Bikini Bottom permanently to return to dry land. Her attachment to Texas is not treated as a minor detail either. She speaks throughout the entire series with a heavy Southern accent, regularly uses phrases and slang associated with the American South, and frequently brings up Texas in ordinary conversation, treating her home state almost like a core part of her personal identity, rather than just a fun character quirk. When SpongeBob and Patrick make fun of Texas during this episode, not realizing how deeply it upsets her, Sandy reacts with real anger, showing a side of her that goes beyond her usual calm, scientific demeanor. This moment reinforces something important about her overall character. Despite thriving underwater, building machines, competing in extreme sports, and outperforming sea creatures at their own physical challenges, Sandy never stops being an outsider who left her actual home behind, and the show occasionally lets that emotional weight show through underneath her tough exterior. For years, the exact reason behind Sandy's original move to Bikini Bottom stayed loosely defined, mostly explained through the idea that she came to study sea creatures as part of her scientific work. That explanation finally got a much more detailed and specific answer decades after the show first began, in the 2024 film Saving Bikini Bottom, Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie. According to that film, Sandy was sent to Bikini Bottom by an organization referred to as the Bureau of Official Texas Science, often shortened to BOOTS, to carry out research on Bikini Bottom and its residents. The film reveals a twist that reframes her entire original mission, showing that the research assignment she believed she was carrying out honestly was actually being used by her own employer, a character named Tsunami, who serves as the film's main antagonist, as a form of surveillance on the underwater city, all without Sandy's full knowledge or consent. In effect, the film recasts Sandy as an unwitting Trojan horse, used by her own government-funded agency to gather information on Bikini Bottom for purposes she never agreed to and did not fully understand until the events of the film itself. This reveal gave longtime fans a far more specific and complete origin story than anything the original series had directly confirmed before, tying her presence underwater to an actual organization with its own agenda, rather than leaving her motivations as a loosely implied research trip mentioned only in passing. Even with that expanded backstory now firmly established through the newer film, the core of who Sandy is has stayed remarkably consistent since her very first appearance back in 1999. She has always been the toughest, smartest, and most physically capable member of the main cast, an air-breathing land mammal thriving in a world built entirely for creatures that breathe water, using nothing but her own intelligence, engineering skills, and sheer physical determination to make that survival possible. Her design itself reflects this balance directly, giving her a recognizably real squirrel appearance, complete with brown fur, a bushy tail, prominent front teeth, and small rounded ears, while also giving her a fully human-shaped body, capable of building machines, wearing clothing, and interacting with the world the same way any of the show's other characters do. That blend of real animal traits and human-level intelligence and dexterity is exactly what allows her character to function as both a believable scientist and a believable action hero within the same show, something none of the other characters are really built to do in quite the same way. And it is exactly why, out of every citizen living in Bikini Bottom, she remains the clearest living reminder that this entire underwater world was never built around one single, tidy set of biological rules. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to blend real science with total absurdity shows up constantly throughout the show, though never in a way as dark as what one corner of the internet once invented, a fake episode that never actually existed, yet somehow became famous enough that the real show eventually had to respond to it. Section 7. Squidward's Suicide, the lost episode that never existed. Somewhere in the long history of scary stories that spread across the internet, one particular tale managed to attach itself to one of the most cheerful cartoons ever made. It claimed that a real episode of this show was created, filmed, and then hidden away forever because it was simply too disturbing for anyone to see. For years, this story convinced huge numbers of people that a genuinely dark, secret piece of SpongeBob history existed somewhere in a locked studio vault. None of it was true, but the story became so widely known that the actual show eventually had to acknowledge it existed, turning a piece of internet fiction into something the real series could no longer fully ignore. This story belongs to a category of internet writing known as creepypasta, a term used to describe short horror stories that spread online, often written to look and feel like true personal accounts, rather than obvious fiction. Creepypasta stories have existed since the earlier days of internet forums and message boards, and one of the most popular styles to come out of that genre involves the idea of a lost episode, a piece of media, usually a cartoon or children's show, that was supposedly made and then banned or destroyed because something happened during production that was too frightening or disturbing to broadcast. This particular subgenre works so well because it plays on something almost everyone who grew up watching cartoons can relate to: the strange feeling of nostalgia mixed with the unsettling idea that something familiar and innocent might be hiding a darker secret underneath. The specific story connected to SpongeBob is usually called Squidward's Suicide, though many people online also refer to it by the alternate title Red Mist. According to most versions of the story, it first appeared online on April 6, 2010, posted anonymously to a message board on a website called 7chan, specifically within a section dedicated to paranormal topics. The original post was written from the point of view of someone claiming to have worked as an intern at a television studio around 2005 during the production of the show's 4th season. According to the story, this intern and a small group of co-workers were gathered to review a batch of new episodes ahead of their broadcast, a normal part of the production process. Among the episodes they were supposed to watch was one that was meant to be an ordinary episode, but the file they actually received had a different title card attached to it, one that read Squidward's Suicide instead of the episode they were expecting. The story goes on to describe the group initially assuming this strange title was simply an inside joke among the animators, something not unusual in a production environment where staff sometimes use unofficial or playful placeholder titles before a final version is locked in. As the footage kept playing, the tone of the story shifts from mildly amusing to increasingly disturbing. According to the narrative, the episode begins in a way that looks completely normal, with Squidward practicing his clarinet while SpongeBob and Patrick interrupt him outside his house, a very typical kind of scene for this show. From there, the story describes small technical glitches appearing in the footage, repeated frames, sound that does not match up correctly with the animation, and a growing sense that something about the episode is deeply wrong. The narrative escalates from there, describing a live performance scene where Squidward is humiliated in front of an audience, followed by increasingly unsettling and graphic imagery as the episode continues, eventually building toward a version of Squidward taking his own life. Part of what made the original creepypasta especially disturbing to readers was an added claim describing disturbing images allegedly hidden within individual frames of the episode, spliced in so briefly that they could only be noticed if someone paused the footage at the right exact moment. According to the story, these hidden frames appeared to show real photographs of children who had died, and the tale suggested that the true creator of the episode and the origin of these disturbing images was never identified. This detail pushed the story beyond a simple ghost story about a haunted cartoon and turned it into something that implied a real, unsolved crime might be connected to the footage, which is a large part of why the story spread as aggressively as it did once people started sharing it. As unsettling as the original story reads, none of it holds up under any real scrutiny, and multiple later investigations into the legend have broken down exactly why. Researchers and fans looking into the claims found that many of the specific sounds and visuals described in the story could be traced directly back to actual, legitimate SpongeBob episodes that had already aired. The unsettling clarinet playing described in the story lines up closely with an existing scene from an earlier episode called Bubble Stand, and the supposed corpse imagery that people claimed to see when freezing frames from fan-made recreation videos turned out, upon closer inspection, to be blurry, low-quality images open to a wide range of interpretation rather than any kind of clear, verifiable photograph. Some recreations that circulated afterward, made by fans attempting to bring the fictional episode to life for video sharing platform 4Ms, even reused an already existing scene of Squidward appearing lifeless from a real episode called Skill Crane, further blurring the line between the original creepypasta text and later fan-made content built around it. The origin of the story itself eventually became somewhat clearer as well. In 2013, a Reddit user using the name Suicide Squidward came forward, claiming to be the original author of the story, describing it plainly as a piece of creative fiction written specifically as an example of the lost episode creepypasta genre, rather than any kind of true account. This claim lines up with how the entire lost episode subgenre developed during this same period, since numerous similar stories about supposedly banned or destroyed episodes of other well-known cartoons and games were being written and shared across the same corners of the internet around this exact time. Squidward's Suicide simply became one of the most widely spread and long-lasting examples of that trend, likely because it was attached to a show as universally recognized and beloved as SpongeBob SquarePants. The legend became so widely known within online horror communities that it eventually developed something of a reputation problem within those same communities. Some archives dedicated to collecting and organizing creepypasta stories later removed earlier drafts and versions of Squidward's Suicide, citing concerns about poor writing quality, inconsistent details between different retellings, and plot elements that felt more like exaggerated shock value than a well-constructed horror story. Even within a genre built entirely around clearly fictional internet horror writing, this particular story eventually stood out as an example of the format being pushed to an extreme that some longtime members of those communities felt had gone too far, especially given how the story tried to tie itself to the deaths of real children children as part of its central twist. None of that controversy stopped the story from becoming one of the most recognized pieces of internet folklore connected to the show, and its popularity eventually reached a point where the actual production team behind SpongeBob decided to respond to it directly, though in a lighthearted and clearly self-aware way, rather than treating it as a serious threat to the brand. In 2019, an episode called SpongeBob in Random Land aired, built around a surreal, dreamlike plot involving the characters traveling through a strange, distorted alternate universe. Within that episode, during a sequence where Squidward moves through a series of doors leading to different bizarre versions of Bikini Bottom, one of those doors briefly reveals a version of Squidward with glowing red eyes, closely resembling the way the character was described in the original creepypasta story, complete with a scream that closely echoed the sound described in fan retellings of the legend. This brief moment functioned as a direct wink toward longtime fans who were familiar with the old internet legend, acknowledging its existence within the show itself for the first time, even while keeping the reference quick, exaggerated, and clearly intended as a joke, rather than anything meant to be taken seriously. The reaction to this small moment was immediate and enthusiastic across social media once the episode aired. Longtime fans who had grown up hearing about the Squidward suicide legend during their earlier years online reacted with genuine excitement at seeing their own personal internet folklore acknowledged by the real show, treating the reference less like something disturbing and more like a fun piece of trivia connecting two very different eras of how people engaged with the franchise. One through traditional television broadcasts, and one through internet forums, message boards, and shared horror stories passed between strangers online. Looking at the full picture of this story from start to finish says something interesting about how modern audiences interact with shows they grew up watching. A story with absolutely no basis in reality, invented entirely by an anonymous internet user, managed to spread widely enough and persist long enough that it eventually became a recognized, semi-official piece of the show's cultural footprint, referenced directly by the actual production team responsible for the real series. It highlights just how much power internet storytelling can hold over how people remember and relate to media from their childhood, sometimes blending completely fictional internet content with real official material until the line between the two becomes genuinely blurry for casual viewers who only heard pieces of the story secondhand. It is worth being clear about what this story actually is and is not. No such episode was ever produced, filmed, or broadcast by the studio behind this show at any point in its history. The entire narrative originated as a piece of creative horror fiction, written in a style designed to mimic a true first-hand account, a common and well-established technique used throughout the creepypasta genre to make invented stories feel more believable and unsettling to readers encountering them for the first time online. The show's own brief acknowledgement of the legend years later should be understood the same way, as a playful nod to an old piece of internet culture, not any kind of confirmation that anything described in the original story ever actually happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Long before the internet had any interest in inventing dark stories about episodes that never existed, the real show was already dealing with a much more grounded kind of controversy, one involving actual episodes that really were pulled from broadcast, not because some anonymous stranger made up a scary story about them, but because the network itself decided certain scenes had crossed a line that needed to be addressed. Section 8. The Banned Episodes. Not every SpongeBob mystery comes from an anonymous internet post or a fan theory built on loose guesswork. Some of the most talked about controversies connected to this show are not stories at all. They are documented decisions made by an actual television network. Decisions that pulled real, finished episodes out of circulation for reasons the network itself has publicly explained. Unlike the fake lost episode legend that spread online years ago, these cases involve real episodes that really did air at some point and really were removed, quietly or otherwise, from future broadcasts and streaming platforms. The most well-known case involves an episode from the show's third season called Midlife Crustacean. The plot follows Mr. Krabs going through a moment of feeling old and out of touch, prompting him to ask SpongeBob and Patrick to join him for a wild night out so he can feel young again. Over the course of the episode, the trio trio ends up breaking into a house to steal a pair of underwear as part of what the episode frames as a playful prank, only for the situation to take an awkward turn when they discover that the house they broke into actually belongs to Mr. Krabs' own mother, who catches all three of them in the act and sends her grown son to bed like a child as punishment. For more than a decade after it originally aired, this episode remained part of normal rotation, airing in reruns and appearing on home video releases without any special controversy attached to it. That changed starting in 2018, when Nickelodeon quietly stopped airing the episode altogether. The network did not offer much public explanation at the time, and the removal went largely unnoticed by casual viewers for a while, since older episodes rotating in and out of a broadcast schedule is not unusual on its own. The situation became much more widely known in 2021, when a Nickelodeon spokesperson gave a direct, on-the-record explanation to reporters. According to that statement, the episode had been reviewed internally, and the network determined that the underwear theft plot, generally understood to reference an old-style college prank tradition, sometimes called a panty raid, was not appropriate content for a children's show, and needed to be permanently pulled from circulation. This statement confirmed what many fans had already suspected, that the episode was removed specifically because of that one storyline, rather than any technical issue or unrelated licensing problem. The consequences of that decision extended beyond just Nickelodeon's own broadcast schedule. Streaming platforms and digital retailers that carried the show's back catalog followed the same removal, with services including Amazon Video dropping Midlife Crustacean from their available episode libraries as well. When Paramount later launched its own major streaming platform and used the availability of every classic SpongeBob episode as a selling point in its advertising, Midlife Crustacean remained the one clear exception, quietly left out of that promise, despite technically belonging to the earlier seasons being advertised. As of now, it remains the only episode in the show's entire history that has been permanently and completely removed from official circulation, with no announced plans from Nickelodeon or Paramount to ever bring it back. A second, very different case involves an episode from season 12 called Quarantined Crab. The plot centers on a health inspector visiting the Krusty Krab and informing everyone inside that a customer has come down with something called the clam flu, prompting the restaurant to be placed under quarantine while panic spreads among the trapped staff and customers. Under normal circumstances, this kind of storyline would likely have aired without drawing much attention at all, since outbreak and quarantine plots are a common comedic setup used across all kinds of television shows. The problem in this case came down entirely to unfortunate timing, rather than anything actually offensive contained within the episode itself. The episode had been written and produced roughly 2 years before it was scheduled to air, long before anyone involved could have known that a real global pandemic would soon dominate daily life around the world. Once the coronavirus pandemic began spreading in early 2020, Nickelodeon made the decision to pull Quarantined Crab from its planned broadcast, explaining publicly that the choice was based purely on sensitivity toward the ongoing real-world crisis, not because the episode contained anything inappropriate on its own merits. This distinction matters since it separates Quarantined Crab from Midlife Crustacean in an important way. One episode was pulled because the network decided its actual content was unsuitable for children. The other was pulled because outside real-world events made an otherwise harmless plot feel uncomfortable or poorly timed for audiences dealing with a genuine health crisis in their own lives. Unlike Midlife Crustacean, the ban on Quarantined Crab turned out to be temporary. As the initial peak of the pandemic passed, and much of daily life around the world slowly returned to a more normal rhythm, Nickelodeon and Paramount lifted the restriction on the episode, allowing it to finally air and stream starting in April of 2022, a little over 2 years after it was originally supposed to debut. Even after being restored to streaming platforms and cable reruns, the episode has still never been included in any official DVD release of the season, making it something of a partial exception even after the ban itself was lifted. A third example goes back much further in the show's history and connects directly to a real-world tragedy rather than a shifting standards review or a pandemic. The episode in question is called Just One Bite, and it originally aired in the show's very early seasons. Part of the plot involves Squidward attempting to sneak into the Krusty Krab after hours, only for the situation to go badly wrong when a bucket of gasoline gets knocked over and catches fire, resulting in Squidward being set ablaze not once, but twice, as he stumbles through the restaurant restaurant trying to reach a hidden vault. This sequence originally aired as written, but it was pulled from later broadcasts, particularly within the United States, and multiple sources tracking the show's broadcast history have pointed to the same likely explanation. The episode originally aired within about a month of the September 11th, 2001 attacks in the United States, and the specific imagery of a character being deliberately set on fire during an act of forced entry took on a very different tone in the aftermath of those events. While Nickelodeon never issued as detailed a public statement about this particular cut as it eventually did for Midlife Crustacean or Quarantined Crab, the timing lines up closely enough that most people who have researched the show's broadcast history treat the connection as effectively confirmed, especially since the same fire-related sequence was left untouched in certain international broadcasts outside the United States, including versions shown in Canada and South Korea, suggesting the edit was tied to a specific, localized sensitivity rather than a universal content standard applied everywhere the show aired. These three cases show that the idea of a banned SpongeBob episode covers a much wider range of situations than most casual viewers realize. Midlife Crustacean represents a permanent removal based on content the network eventually decided was never appropriate for children in the first place, regardless of when it originally aired. Quarantined Crab represents a temporary removal based entirely on unfortunate real-world timing, with a storyline that was never inherently inappropriate on its own terms. Just One Bite represents an even older example, an edit made specifically in response to a national tragedy that happened to occur close to the episode's original air date, changing how a piece of already finished, already approved content was perceived almost overnight. Beyond these three widely reported cases, the show has also gone through smaller-scale editing decisions over the years that fall short of a full ban, but still count as real, documented changes made after episodes had already aired in their original form. Certain individual scenes across different episodes have been trimmed or removed in later broadcasts and home releases, often involving moments of cartoon violence considered slightly too intense for younger viewers, such as a scene depicting an imagined car crash that was cut from some airings due to concerns about its intensity, though this particular edit was later reversed and restored in more recent broadcasts. Some countries outside the United States have also applied their own separate editing standards to the show, entirely independent of decisions made by the American network, occasionally replacing songs due to copyright licensing differences between regions, or trimming individual jokes and sound effects that were considered fine in one country's broadcast standards but not another's. This pattern shows that content standards for children's television are not treated as one single fixed rulebook applied identically everywhere the show is broadcast, but rather as a shifting set of decisions made separately by different regional broadcasters, occasionally revisited and changed again years later as attitudes and circumstances shift. Taken together, these documented cases paint a very different picture from the internet legend explored earlier, involving a fictional lost episode that never actually existed. There is no need for anonymous internet postings or invented horror stories when talking about Midlife Crustacean, Quarantined Crab, or Just One Bite, since all three cases are backed by verifiable broadcast history, official statements from Nickelodeon representatives, and consistent reporting across multiple entertainment news outlets covering the story as it unfolded. The real censorship history of this show turns out to be less about hidden horror and more about a network repeatedly re-evaluating older content against changing standards, sometimes permanently, sometimes only for a short period of time, depending entirely on the specific reason behind each individual decision. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While network executives were busy deciding which finished episodes were fit for broadcast, one character living inside the show itself had already spent decades failing at almost everything he attempted, driven by a rivalry so consistent and so specific that it has defined nearly every single appearance he has made since the very first season. A villain whose backstory turns out to be far more detailed and far more personal than most casual viewers ever realized. Section 9. Plankton, Karen, and the Villain Who Never Wins. Every single day, across dozens of episodes spanning more than 2 decades, one tiny green creature wakes up with the exact same goal in mind: stealing a burger recipe from the restaurant across the street. On the surface, this looks like a simple, one-dimensional villain plot built purely for repeatable jokes. Underneath that surface, the show eventually revealed something far more layered, a real friendship that turned into a lifelong rivalry built on shared poverty, shared bullying, and one burger that never should have worked in the first place. Sheldon J. Plankton runs a restaurant called the Chum Bucket, sitting directly across the street from the much more successful Krusty Krab. He first appeared on screen in an episode simply titled Plankton, which aired on July 31st, 1999, making him one of the earliest characters introduced after the show's original premiere. From that very first appearance onward, his defining goal has never changed. He wants the Krabby Patty secret formula, and he wants Mr. Krabs' restaurant to fail so his own business can finally succeed. Nearly every scheme he attempts across the entire series circles back to this same basic motivation, whether it involves elaborate machines, disguises, robotic helpers, or outright theft. For a long stretch of the show's early seasons, this rivalry was simply presented as an established fact. Two competing restaurant owners locked in an ongoing battle with no real explanation given for how it started or why it had become so personal. That changed with an episode from season 5 called Friend or Foe, which finally gave viewers a detailed look into the shared history between these two characters, and the answer turned out to be far more surprising than most fans expected going in. According to the story told in that episode, Mr. Krabs and Plankton were not always enemies. In fact, according to the flashbacks shown throughout the episode, the two of them were born on the exact same day at the exact same hospital, making them connected from the very earliest possible point in their lives. As young children, both of them ended up on the outside of their peer group for very different reasons. Plankton was mocked and excluded for being unusually intelligent, treated as a nerd by classmates who found his intelligence strange or off-putting. Mr. Krabs faced a different kind of exclusion, coming from a family that struggled financially, to the point where the episode shows him needing to wear clothing fashioned out of rags during a period when his family could not afford anything better. Rather than being pulled apart by these different struggles, the two of them were pushed together by them, becoming close friends specifically because neither one fit in anywhere else. Their friendship eventually led them toward the exact same food business that would go on to define both of their entire adult lives. According to the story, the two of them and their other classmates used to regularly eat at a small local restaurant called Stinky Burgers, a favorite lunch spot for the neighborhood kids. That restaurant eventually shut down due to a case of food poisoning linked to its cooking, leaving a gap that young Mr. Krabs and Plankton decided to fill themselves. Determined to build something out of the situation, the two friends opened their own burger stand on the same spot where Stinky Burgers used to operate, giving their new venture the name Plabs Burgers, a combination of their two names. Their first attempts at cooking together did not go well at all. Multiple early tries at a burger recipe ended in complete failure, with customers spitting the food out and throwing it away in disgust. The moment that would eventually change everything happened almost entirely by accident. During one especially heated argument between the two of them, a nearby shelf gets knocked over, sending a random combination of ingredients spilling directly into the batch of patty mixture they had been working on. Neither of them planned this moment or intended it as any kind of deliberate recipe breakthrough. It was a complete accident, born out of frustration and a physical argument, rather than any careful experimentation. When customers tried this new, accidentally created burger the following day, they loved it immediately, giving Mr. Krabs and Plankton their first real success, and creating what would eventually become known across all of Bikini Bottom as the Krabby Patty. Success did not save their friendship. Shortly after their breakthrough recipe started attracting real customers, a man named Old Man Jenkins tried an earlier, still unrefined version of the burger and ended up seriously ill, leading to public backlash against their small restaurant. Rather than working through the setback together, Mr. Krabs and Plankton immediately began blaming each other for the failure, accusing one another of ruining the recipe. Their argument escalated into a physical struggle over the written formula itself, which ended with the piece of paper containing their recipe getting torn cleanly in half during the fight. Plankton ended up with the bottom portion of the torn paper, which happened to contain only the line describing a pinch of chum as an ingredient, while Mr. Krabs kept the rest, effectively ending their partnership and their friendship at the same moment. What makes Friend or Foe such a memorable episode is not just the reveal of this shared backstory, but the way it presents that backstory. Rather than simply telling the audience a single agreed-upon version of events, the episode shows Mr. Krabs' account of the story first, followed immediately afterward by Plankton showing up to argue that Mr. Krabs got several key details wrong. Plankton then offers his own version of the exact same events, which matches Mr. Krabs' story almost beat for beat, except for one crucial difference. In Plankton's retelling, the roles during their final physical fight over the recipe are completely reversed, with Plankton coming across as the more capable, more justified party in the conflict, rather than Mr. Krabs. Neither character is willing to admit any real fault in how their friendship ended, each shaping the memory in a way that makes themselves look better and the other look worse. The episode resolves this conflicting storytelling by bringing in a third voice entirely, Karen, Plankton's computer wife, who reveals that she has access to the real, unaltered truth of what happened, since she was originally functioning as a security camera system present at the restaurant during the actual events being described. Her retelling lines up closely with both earlier versions in terms of the basic sequence of events, but strips away the self-serving details each character had quietly added to make themselves look better, giving viewers something closer to an objective account of exactly how the friendship truly fell apart. Karen herself deserves attention as her own character, separate from her role in settling this particular dispute. She functions as Plankton's wife throughout the series, though she exists as a highly advanced computer system rather than a living creature, complete with her own screen, her own voice, and her own distinct personality that frequently leans towards sarcasm and blunt honesty, especially when reacting to Plankton's constantly failing schemes. According to background details from the show's production history, Karen was named directly after Karen Umland, the real-life wife of creator Steven Hillenburg, a small personal touch tucked into the design of one of the show's most consistently recurring supporting characters. Despite being built as a machine rather than a biological creature, Karen frequently serves as the most level-headed, rational voice in any given episode involving Plankton, often coming up with the actual technical details behind his plans, while also being the character most willing to point out when those plans are obviously doomed to fail from the very beginning. Even with this deep, complicated shared history now fully established through friend or foe, the show has never used this backstory to soften or resolve the ongoing rivalry between Mr. Krabs and Plankton in any lasting way. Immediately after the flashback sequences end within that same episode, the two of them go right back to their usual dynamic, arguing and undermining each other exactly the way they always have throughout the rest of the series. That said, the show has occasionally allowed brief glimpses of a more complicated relationship beneath the constant scheming, particularly in later episodes, such as New Leaf and Best Frenemies, both of which show moments where the two rivals manage to get along, cooperate, or even show genuine concern for one another, before inevitably sliding back into their usual competitive routine by the episode's end. These occasional soft moments never erase or override the core rivalry that defines their relationship across the vast majority of the show's episodes, but they do add a layer of nuance that a simple hero versus villain framing would otherwise miss entirely. Plankton's status as the show's primary antagonist has also shifted somewhat over the course of the series' long run. In its earliest seasons, and especially in the original 2004 feature film, he functions as the clearest, most direct villain in the entire franchise, culminating in a moment within that film where he actually succeeds at stealing the Krabby Patty formula, only to have his larger plan for expanding his fast food empire and asserting broader control ultimately stopped by SpongeBob before it can go any further. This moment stands out specifically because it represents one of the only times across the franchise's entire history where Plankton actually achieves the one goal he has spent decades chasing, even if his larger ambitions still end in total failure immediately afterward. In many of the show's later seasons, his role shifts somewhat away from being treated as a true, dangerous threat, and more toward being a consistent source of comedic tension, a character whose failures have become such a reliable and expected part of the show's formula that audiences tune in almost expecting him to fail in a new and creative way each time, rather than genuinely wondering whether he might finally succeed. Looking back at the full picture painted by friend or foe, the entire rivalry that has powered so much of this show's comedy for over 2 decades traces back to two lonely, bullied children who found comfort in each other before an argument over a torn piece of paper turned them into lifelong opponents. opponents. It is a surprisingly grounded, almost sad origin story, sitting underneath a cartoon built around jokes involving tiny robots, giant machines, and endless failed heists. And it adds a level of emotional weight to their ongoing conflict that most viewers, especially those who first watched this show as young children, likely never noticed was there all along. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more piece of this entire underwater world that ties every earlier section of this video together. Not a character, not a rivalry, and not a single mysterious object, but the man responsible for building all of it in the first place, and the quiet, personal reasons behind why this strange little city under the sea has managed to stay so deeply loved for more than 25 years after it first appeared on screen. Section 10. What Bikini Bottom left behind. Every city needs someone who built it, and Bikini Bottom is no different. Behind the jokes about Krabby Patties, the karate matches with a squirrel in a diving suit, and the endless failed schemes of a tiny green villain, there was one real person holding the entire world together. And understanding how his story ended says a lot about why this show has managed to stay so deeply loved for more than 25 years. By the middle of the 2010s, Steven Hillenburg had already stepped away from his original role as showrunner, a decision he made back in 2004 following the release of the first SpongeBob movie, which he also directed. Stepping back from that day-to-day leadership role did not mean stepping away from the franchise entirely. He stayed connected as an executive producer, kept a hand in major creative decisions, and eventually returned in a much more hands-on capacity to co-write the story for the second SpongeBob film, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, released in 2015. Around this same period, the world of SpongeBob expanded in a completely new direction, moving from television screens onto an actual Broadway stage. A full musical adaptation of the show opened in 2017, featuring original songs written by a wide range of well-known musicians, and the production went on to earn 12 Tony Award nominations, an enormous achievement for a stage show built around a cartoon character originally designed to entertain children on Saturday mornings. It was during this same stretch of major milestones that Hillenburg shared news with the public that would eventually change everything. On March 14th, 2017, he released a personal statement confirming that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, more commonly known as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, a serious and progressive condition that gradually affects a person's ability to control their muscles over time. In his own words, shared directly through a statement given to the entertainment publication Variety, Hillenburg made clear that he intended to keep working. He said that anyone who truly knew him would understand that he planned to continue working on SpongeBob SquarePants and his other passions for as long as he remained physically able to do so. Alongside that commitment to keep working, he and his family asked for privacy during what was clearly going to be an extremely difficult period, a request that Nickelodeon publicly respected in its own official response at the time. True to his word, Hillenburg did not disappear from public life immediately after sharing his diagnosis. In April of 2018, roughly a year after going public with his condition, he was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Daytime Emmy Awards, a recognition of his decades-long contribution to animation and children's television. Tom Kenny, the voice actor who had brought SpongeBob to life since the character's very first episode, personally introduced Hillenburg during the ceremony, using the moment to describe exactly how much of the character's personality came directly from the man who created him. According to Kenny's tribute that night, while his own voice gave SpongeBob his literal sound, the character's playful spirit, his sense of gentle mischief, and the constant joy he takes in his colorful, music-filled world all came 100% from Hillenburg himself. It was a public, heartfelt moment that gave fans and colleagues alike a chance to honor him while he was still there to hear it. Later that same year, on November 26, 2018, Steven Hillenburg passed away at the age of 57, following his battle with ALS. Nickelodeon confirmed the news publicly the following day, sharing a tribute through their official social media accounts and observing a moment of silence in his honor. In a fuller statement released alongside that announcement, the network described him as a beloved friend and longtime creative partner to everyone who had worked alongside him, crediting him with giving SpongeBob SquarePants a unique sense of humor and innocence that had brought joy to generations of kids and families around the world. The statement went on to describe Bikini Bottom itself as a lasting reminder of the value of optimism, friendship, and the limitless power of imagination. A fitting way to sum up exactly what Hillenburg had spent decades building. Tributes to Hillenburg continued pouring in from people who had worked directly alongside him throughout his career. Ethan Slater, the actor who had played SpongeBob in the Broadway musical and earned a Tony nomination for the role, shared his own personal message shortly after the news broke, describing Hillenburg not only as a creative genius, but as someone who was genuinely generous and kind in person, someone who had warmly welcomed the entire Broadway cast into what Slater called his wonderful SpongeBob family from the very beginning. He is survived by his wife of 20 years, Karen Hillenburg, along with their son Clay, his mother Nancy Hillenburg, and his brother Brian Kelly Hillenburg. One of the more unusual tributes to Hillenburg's legacy came from an unexpected corner of pop culture entirely disconnected from cartoons or animation. Following news of his passing, a public petition began circulating online, calling for a song from the show, a triumphant instrumental piece called Sweet Victory that had appeared in a memorable Season 2 episode, to be performed live during the Super Bowl halftime show as a tribute to his memory. The petition spread rapidly, gathering more than 770,000 signatures within just a matter of days, showing just how widely and deeply this cartoon had embedded itself into the lives of people who had grown up watching it, well past the point of simply being remembered as a children's show. While that specific halftime tribute never fully came together the way fans had hoped, the sheer scale of public support behind the idea said everything about how much Hillenburg's work had meant to an entire generation of viewers who were now old enough to organize petitions and campaigns in his honor. What Hillenburg left behind extended far beyond nostalgia alone. By the time of his death, SpongeBob SquarePants had already grown into one of the most successful and widely distributed pieces of media Nickelodeon had ever produced, spawning multiple feature films, an award-nominated Broadway show, and hundreds of episodes translated and broadcast in countries all around the world. That growth did not stop after he passed away either. The show continued producing new seasons and specials in the years following his death, reaching its 25th anniversary in 2024, a milestone celebrated with new spin-off projects, including Camp Coral, The Patrick Star Show, and Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie, along with real-world tie-ins like the limited-time Krabby Patty collaboration released through Wendy's that same year. A show built by a marine biology teacher who once drew a comic book about tide pools to help teach children about ocean life, somehow turned into a multi-generational franchise, still expanding a quarter century after its first episode aired. None of the strange details, hidden theories, and dark internet legends explored throughout this video would exist at all without the specific, personal choices Hillenburg made while building this world in the first place. His decision to root Bikini Bottom in real marine biology gave fans enough believable detail to start asking serious questions about how any of it could actually work. His choice to borrow the name of a real nuclear test site for the setting's title, likely picked simply because it sounded fun and fit the ocean theme, ended up fueling one of the darkest and most persistent fan theories the show has ever produced. His willingness to let small, strange details slip into scripts, a soul sold to a ghost here, a friendship torn apart by a burger recipe there, gave dedicated fans decades worth of material to dig through, debate, and build entire theories around long after the original episodes had finished airing. Bikini Bottom was never built to be a perfectly logical place. It was built by someone who understood the ocean deeply enough to make even its strangest, silliest jokes feel oddly believable, and who cared enough about the world he created to keep working on it for as long as his body allowed him to. That combination, real science wrapped inside pure imagination, is exactly why this city under the sea has managed to hold on to so many mysteries, theories, and unanswered questions for over 25 years, and why people are still watching, still theorizing, and still finding new reasons to fall asleep to the sound of Bikini Bottom, long after the man who built it first sat down to draw a sponge in a tide pool comic book, never once imagining how far that little character would eventually go. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.